Imagine this. A ship creaks in the waves, its sails torn, its deck stained with smoke and blood. The battle is over. A Spanish galleon lies crippled behind you. Her treasure holds heavy with silver, spices, and gold. The pirates cheer, but their eyes are already calculating. Not about the victory itself, but about what comes next, the division of loot. And here is the shocking truth. Unlike the chaos you might expect, pirates didn't simply grab what they could carry. They ran their ships like a ruthless, highly organized business. Every coin, every bar of silver, every ounce of rum accounted for, divided, and distributed according to rules that would shock modern corporations with their fairness and brutality all at once. So, if you've ever wondered how pirates kept order among greedy, dangerous men with knives at their belts and mutiny always a whisper away, the answer is found in one of the most fascinating systems of profit sharing in history. Forget Hollywood's image of drunken chaos, where the strongest simply take what they want. Real pirates lived and died by an economic code that was both brutally practical and surprisingly democratic. Because without rules, the Brotherhood of Thieves would collapse into knives and blood before they even left port. And no captain, no matter how feared, could command the loyalty if he couldn't promise his crew a fair share. That SY pirate loot was divided with a level of detail that would make an accountant proud. And the more you look into it, the more you realize these outlaws of the sea created by one of the first experiments in corporate equity. So how did it work? Let's step into the shoes of a pirate on the deck of a captured ship. You've risked your life in battle. You've swung across ropes, fought in smoke and chaos, maybe watched your comrades fall. Now, the chest is cracked open. Inside, piles of silver coins glinting like moonlight. The air is tense. Every man has sweat on his brow, not from fear, but from anticipation. Because how this treasure is divided will decide whether you stay loyal or whether blades come out in the night. At the heart of this system was the pirate code, often written down and sworn to before voyages began. It wasn't just vague promises. It was specific, almost mathematical. Each crew member knew exactly what percentage he was entitled to, based on his role and risk. The captain, contrary to myth, he didn't take everything. In fact, he usually received only 2 shares, maybe 3, that's it. Compare that to a common sailor who got 1 share. The quartermaster, the man who acted as a balance of power against the captain, often received the same as the captain. Skilled roles, like carpenters or gunners, might get 1.5 shares, recognizing their importance in keeping the ship alive. And ordinary crewmen, they got 1 full share. No less. That meant a pirate crew was one of the most financially equal workplaces of its time. Imagine that a world where the CEO makes only double what the lowest worker does, when today the gap can be hundreds or thousands of times greater. But pirates were not idealists. This wasn't about fairness for its own sake, it was about survival. If a captain grew greedy, if he claimed too much for himself, his men would mutiny, and his life would end with the point of a blade. The system of shares was a social contract written in blood and reinforced by the knowledge that on a pirate ship, everyone was armed, and no one feared using steel. So fairness wasn't optional. It was mandatory. The process itself could be meticulous. After a capture, the loot would be collected, recorded, and distributed according to the pre-agreed shares. Money, of course, was easy to divide. But what about goods? What about barrels of rum, crates of spices, silks, or weapons? These were usually sold later, and the money divided. But pirates were also practical. If food was scarce, if rum was needed, they might agree to immediate distribution for consumption. And here lies another detail. Pirates were masters of cutting through complexity. They created a system that balanced strict order with brutal flexibility. Now, here's where it gets even more fascinating. Pirate codes often included clauses for injury compensation. If you lost a limb in battle, you weren't left to starve. The ship's loot would pay you a set amount, sometimes hundreds of silver pieces for an arm, a leg, or even an eye. In a world where governments abandoned wounded soldiers, pirates created an early form of workers' compensation. Was it because they were humane? Not exactly. It was because they knew no man would risk his life in a boarding action if he thought crippling injury meant ruin. By guaranteeing payouts, they bought courage, they bought loyalty, they bought blood for gold. And in doing so, they transformed raw greed into something resembling structure. Think about that for a moment. Pirates' men, we imagine, as ruthless criminals, were offering something closer to health insurance and equal pay than many legitimate states of their time. In Britain, naval sailors were often cheated of their pay, beaten, and treated as disposable. Merchants exploited their crews mercilessly. But aboard a pirate ship, the rules were clear, and everyone had a stake. No wonder sailors deserted navies to join them. A pirate life was shorter, bloodier, but in some ways more just. And yet, don't mistake this for utopia. Greed never disappeared. Fights broke out. Quartermasters sometimes skimmed from the shares. Captains sometimes bent the rules. There were accusations, trials, and executions. But the code was always there, like a ghost hanging over every chest of gold. And the reason it survived was simple. It worked. It gave men a reason to fight, not just for their captain, but for themselves. Because when the cannon smoke cleared, they knew they wouldn't be cheated. They knew their share was waiting. Picture this moment. A pirate crew gathers on the deck. The quartermaster stands with a ledger announcing the divisions. 1 share to every able-bodied sailor. 1.5 to the carpenter, 2 shares to the captain, 2 shares to me. The men listen, and they nod. It is fair. It is known. The tension fades, and the gold begins to clink into hands. This ritual mattered as much as the loot itself, because in that ceremony, trust was renewed. The pirates had stared death in the eye, and now they saw the reward for their courage, measured out with cold precision. That, more than anything, bound them together. Now, you might be asking, how did they stop someone from cheating? What if the quartermaster pocketed coins, or the captain took a hidden share? Pirates were clever. They created checks and balances. The quartermaster could overrule the captain in certain matters, ensuring one man didn't grow too powerful. The crew could vote even to remove a leader, and everything was public. Loot was divided openly, under the watch of armed men who had no patience for thieves among thieves. Transparency was their weapon. In some ways, their ships ran more like small republics than autocracies. And yet, the threat of violence was always there, a shadow behind every rule. That tension between order and brutality is what kept the system alive. And here's a question. Did it work in the long term? Yes and no. Pirate ships were not permanent institutions. They lived fast and died fast, much like the men aboard them. But during their brief existence, they were astonishingly effective. Crews held together, battles were fought with desperate courage. And when the loot was good, men lived like kings for a while. But the very fairness of the system also fueled its downfall. Why? Because it made piracy too attractive. Desertions from navies rose. Merchant sailors turned outlaw. Soon, governments realized they weren't just fighting criminals, they were fighting an alternative way of life. And that was dangerous. If ordinary men began to believe that outlaw democracy was more just than their own rulers, the threat wasn't just to trade, it was to the entire social order. That's why the pirate code and the system of loot division was hunted down as fiercely as the men themselves. Kings and merchants could tolerate bandits, but they couldn't tolerate an idea that equality and shared wealth could be enforced at knife point and succeed, even for a short time. It was heresy in the age of hierarchy. And that, more than gold, is why pirate republics burned so brightly and then vanished. But to really understand how pirates divided loot, you need to step back into their world. Picture a tavern on the edge of the Caribbean. Smoke clings to the rafters, rum sloshes in wooden mugs, and men who have tasted the salt of the sea gather around a rough-hewn table. Before they sail, before a single cannon is fired, they write their contract. Not in flowery legal language, but in blunt, direct words everyone can understand. It's called the Articles of Agreement. Each man signs, or if he cannot write, he marks with an X. This isn't ceremony. This is binding law, as strong as iron, and it contains the rules of the voyage, including exactly how the treasure will be divided. Without this, no man would dare risk his life, for he would have no guarantee that the spoils of blood and danger would reach his pocket. What's striking is how detailed these articles could be. They set down not only the division of wealth, but also the behavior aboard ship. Gambling rules, quiet hours, punishments for theft or desertion all spelled out. But the part every man cared about most was the shares. And these documents reveal just how carefully pirates thought about fairness. The captain, the quartermaster, the boatswain, the carpenter, the gunner, even the surgeon, if they had won all with their shares marked. It was the first page of every voyage's business plan. And yes, I call it a business plan because that's exactly what it was. Piracy, for all its blood and smoke, was a calculated economic enterprise. Investors sometimes backed voyages, supplying ships or weapons in exchange for a cut. Crews weren't just gangs of thugs, they were shareholders in a floating company with clear dividends and brutal enforcement. And the strange beauty of it is this: pirates created one of the most effective incentive systems of the 17th and 18th centuries. Because when your profit is directly tied to your courage, when every musket ball you fire could double your payout, men fight harder than any conscripted Navy sailor ever could. Let me give you an example. Imagine you are a gunner crouched beside your cannon as the ship closes in on a fat merchant vessel. The air is thick with powder smoke. You know that if you cripple her with one perfect shot, you're not just serving your captain, you're serving yourself. Every hole you blast in her hull Every mast you shatter, every moment you risk your life, it all comes back to you in silver coins counted at the voyage's end. That knowledge sharpens your focus. That knowledge makes you steady your aim with a grin. This is not loyalty to a flag. This is loyalty to your share. And when the fighting ended, the calculations began. Let's step through a real example. Say the crew captured a merchantman carrying spices and silver, worth perhaps 10,000 pieces of 8 in total. After expenses, repairs to the ship, bribes for safe harbors, supplies for the next leg, say 8,000 remain for division. The captain takes 2 shares, perhaps 400 coins. The quartermaster also takes 2 shares. Skilled specialists, carpenters, gunners, surgeons take 1.5 shares each, about 300 coins. The rest of the crew, 1 share each, 200 coins apiece. For a common sailor who might have earned only a few coins a month in the Navy, this was staggering. A single successful voyage could make him richer in weeks than years of loyal service to a crown. But here lies the twist. Wealth came fast, but it also slipped away just as fast. Pirate crews spent lavishly. They squandered silver on women, rum, gambling, fine clothes, and reckless nights ashore. A man could blow his fortune in a single drunken week in Port Royal or Nassau. Then, empty-pocketed, he would sign on again, ready for another voyage, another share, another gamble with life and death. This cycle of sudden wealth and sudden ruin gave pirate life its intoxicating rhythm. They lived like kings, then like beggars, and then kings again if they survived long enough. And survival was never guaranteed. Every boarding action was a roll of the dice. You might win gold, or you might lose a limb. That's why injury payouts were so crucial. Let's look at one actual pirate code belonging to Captain Bartholomew Roberts, one of the most successful pirates in history. His articles promised 600 pieces of 8 for the loss of a right arm, 500 for a left, 400 for a right leg, 300 for a left leg, and so on. Smaller amounts for an eye or finger. Imagine the relief that gave men. They knew their sacrifice wouldn't leave their families or themselves starving. In a savage way, it was both coldly transactional and oddly humane. The pirate ship became a kind of floating insurance society funded by blood and treasure. But if pirates had such detailed systems, what about disputes? What if men accused the captain of cheating or the quartermaster of skimming shares? This is where the democracy of the pirate ship revealed itself. Unlike in a navy, where a captain's word was law, pirates could vote. They could depose their leaders. They could hold trials, and these weren't empty gestures. Captains were overthrown, quartermasters replaced, ships reorganized, all by crew vote. The loot division system was more than just economics. It was politics, raw and direct. Every share was a vote, every coin a reminder that the crew, not the captain, was the true master of the ship. Now think about the psychology of this. Imagine you're a sailor who has tasted both worlds. In the Navy, you're whipped for disobedience, starved, and cheated of pay. In piracy, you're armed, respected, and promised a fair cut. Yes, the risk of death is higher, but the reward is intoxicating. No wonder men deserted in droves to join pirate crews. Loot division wasn't just about treasure. It was recruitment. It was propaganda. It was proof that piracy wasn't simply crime, it was an alternative way of living. And yet, danger lurked in this very fairness. Because when wealth was divided equally, there was little incentive to save or plan for the future. Crews lived voyage to voyage, burning through gold as quickly as they earned it. This created a strange paradox. Pirates built one of the fairest wage systems in history. But it also chained them to endless risk because their fortunes could vanish in a night. Their democracy was both their strength and their weakness. A pirate captain commanded fiercely in battle, but his authority melted the moment the loot was divided. Wealth made the crew loyal, but only until it was spent. Then, hunger and greed drove them out again, desperate for another prize. This cycle shaped pirate history. The golden age of piracy burned so brightly, not because pirates were invincible, but because they were motivated like no other sailors in the world. Every man fought with the knowledge that victory meant riches in his hand. Every man boarded with fire in his eyes, because every coin was personal. And when governments looked at piracy, that was the true threat they saw. Not just theft, not just disruption of trade, but an economic system that worked well, a system where even the lowest sailor had power, where wealth was shared in ways that monarchs and merchants found dangerous. Pirates weren't just criminals, they were living proof of another possibility. Let me paint you one more scene. The crew has just taken a prize ship. The loot is piled on deck, a glittering mountain of coins, jewelry, and goods. The quartermaster begins the division. Each man watches closely, every coin counted aloud. The sound of silver falling into pouches rings like music. The captain steps back, calm, taking his 2 shares and nothing more. No one dares call him greedy, because the rules are clear, and he has obeyed them. The men cheer, not just for the wealth, but for the fairness. They know, at least on this deck, in this fleeting moment, they are equals bound by steel and coin. Tomorrow, perhaps, they'll die. But tonight, they are rich and they are brothers. But the story of pirate loot division doesn't end with rules and rituals. To really grasp its power, you have to see how it shaped the very psychology of piracy. Because the truth is, pirates weren't simply fighting for gold, they were fighting for identity, for dignity, and for a sense of belonging in a world that otherwise treated them as expendable. And the way treasure was shared made all the difference. Consider the contrast with ordinary sailors. On a Navy ship, your pay came slowly, if at all. Months at sea might end with nothing more than a few miserable coins, while your officers grew fat on bribes and corruption. On merchant ships, life was no better. Captains cut rations, cheated accounts, and pocketed profits. A sailor was a tool to be used and discarded, his life measured in the lash marks on his back. Now compare that to a pirate ship. The moment you joined, you knew your voice mattered, your blade mattered, and when the prize was taken, your share was guaranteed. That promise was intoxicating. It turned the ship itself into a sanctuary of twisted equality, a floating republic of rogues. This is why many pirates referred to themselves not as criminals, but as brothers of the coast. Their community was built on shared risk and shared reward. Every man knew that his courage could bring him riches. Every man also knew that cowardice or betrayal could cost him his cut or his life. It was a brutal, merit-based system, stripped of the hypocrisy of nations that preached honor but practiced exploitation. And when you stood on deck, waiting for the division of treasure, you weren't just waiting for gold. You were waiting for proof that you belonged. Let's dive deeper into the mechanics of these divisions, because they reveal subtle details that movies never show. First, the order of priority. Before the crew received their shares, expenses were deducted. Damage to the ship, repairs to sails and rigging, ammunition spent in battle all came first. This wasn't stinginess. It was survival. A pirate crew knew that without a seaworthy ship, their fortune would end on the ocean floor. So the collective good took precedence. After expenses came the injury payouts, the compensation system that ensured men crippled in service still received dignity. Only after these obligations were fulfilled did the crew receive their shares. This order shows us something profound. Pirates weren't anarchists living in chaos. They understood infrastructure, insurance, and fairness. Their law was bloody, but it was law, and this law reached into every corner of their lives. Some codes even fined men for stealing from the common pot, for gambling debts that spiraled out of control, or for fighting aboard ship. Because every disruption threatened unity. The division of loot was sacred. To violate it was to betray the brotherhood. And betrayal was punished with terrifying swiftness. Mutineers were marooned, left to die on desolate shores. Thieves were whipped or executed. The message was clear. We may be outlaws, but we are outlaws with rules. Now imagine the emotional weight of this. You're standing in line, waiting for your turn, as the quartermaster counts out shares. Each clink of coin is not just money, it is validation. It proves the system works. It proves you weren't cheated. You fought, you bled, and now the silver fills your hands. In that moment, the pirate world makes sense. Tomorrow may bring capture, hanging, or death in a storm. But today, justice has been served in hard currency. But here's the irony, that very fairness bred recklessness. Because pirates knew they would always get their cut, they were more willing to gamble everything in battle. When facing a heavily armed galleon, a navy crew might hesitate, calculating risk against meager pay. Pirates, they charged in, muskets blazing, because they knew if they won, the payoff would be monumental. Equality fueled courage, and courage fueled chaos on the seas. Loot division wasn't just an economic tool, it was a weapon, sharper than cutlass steel. Yet, as fair as this system seemed within the crew, it often masked darker truths. Because while pirates treated each other with a form of equity, outsiders fared differently. Prisoners, merchants, slaves, these were commodities, sold and traded without hesitation. The fairness stopped at the deck's edge. Inside the circle of brothers, there was justice. Outside, there was only plunder. This double standard reveals the contradiction at the heart of piracy. Equality and cruelty coexisted, feeding on each other. To the pirate, fairness was sacred, but only for those who risked life alongside him. And this raises a haunting question. Were pirates truly pioneers of fairness, or were they simply pragmatic killers who needed a system to keep knives out of each other's backs? The answer lies somewhere in between. Their codes weren't born from philosophy or morality. They were born from necessity. When every man is armed, when mutiny is a heartbeat away, fairness is survival. It was less about justice, more about avoiding chaos. But here's the twist: by accident, they stumbled into systems that resembled democracy, profit sharing, and even social insurance. Systems that made them, for a fleeting moment, more progressive than the societies hunting them. And governments knew it. Colonial authorities, merchants, and kings feared piracy not just because of stolen gold, but because of the dangerous ideas it carried. Imagine if common sailors began demanding fair shares on legitimate ships. Imagine if soldiers demanded injury compensation. Imagine if workers demanded votes. The pirate code was a spark that, if left unchecked, could ignite rebellion far beyond the sea. That is why pirate crews were not just criminals, they were political threats. Their loot divisions were radical acts, undermining hierarchies built on exploitation. To rulers, that was intolerable. Now let me tell you a story. In 1719, a pirate crew captured a massive prize worth nearly 80,000 pieces of eight. The division took hours, the quartermaster carefully counting piles of silver until each man's share was ready. When the youngest crew member, barely 17, stepped forward, he received more money in a single moment than his father had earned in a lifetime as a farmer. The boy wept, clutching the coins in disbelief. He wasn't just rich, he was recognized. He had fought alongside hardened men, and now the system had rewarded him as an equal. That night, he drank like a king. A year later, he was hanged, his pockets empty. Such was the rhythm of piracy, dizzying highs, crushing lows, fairness mixed with doom. These stories remind us that pirate loot division was more than arithmetic. It was theater, ritual, and psychological glue. Every clink of coin was a reminder of loyalty. Every share was proof that even in lawlessness there was order. And this is why piracy, for all its blood and chaos, burned so brightly for so long. Because when men are treated as equals, when their courage is rewarded directly, they will fight like devils. The code gave them that fire, and it terrified the world. But here's the cliffhanger. If piracy was so fair, why did it collapse? If the system worked, why didn't it survive longer? The answer lies not in the pirates themselves, but in the world that surrounded them. Because while pirate loot division was brilliant for small, mobile crews, it could not scale. It thrived only in the cracks of empires, not within them. And as empires grew more determined, piracy became a candle burning at both ends, glorious, but doomed to burn out. The downfall of piracy, and with it the system of loot division, wasn't because the rules failed. In fact, the rules worked too well. They bound men together, gave them courage, and turned ragged crews into some of the most dangerous fighting forces on the seas. But every system has its limits, and for the pirates, the very thing that made them strong shared wealth, and equality also made them vulnerable. Let's begin with scale. Pirate ships usually carried crews of 100 or fewer. That size was perfect for their economic model. Everyone could watch the loot division, everyone could enforce fairness, and everyone could share the spoils. But what happens when you try to expand? When crews grew larger, or fleets joined forces, the system began to strain. More mouths meant thinner shares. More voices meant louder disputes. And suddenly, the fairness that had bound them together could ignite fights instead. Pirates were brilliant at running small-scale operations, but they were never able to build empires because the system that made them equal at sea would have fractured under the weight of real governance. And then there was the problem of time. A pirate's life was brutally short. The average career lasted less than 5 years before death, capture, or disease struck. This meant the loot division system was never tested across generations. It wasn't built to sustain stability. It was built to burn bright, to keep men loyal for as long as they lived, which often wasn't long at all. Imagine a society where no one expected to retire, where the future didn't matter because the rope or the sea would claim you first. In such a world, the fair division of treasure wasn't about legacy, it was about survival in the moment. And while that made pirates fearless, it also meant their system couldn't last. Still, for those brief years, pirate loot division created spectacles that echoed across the Caribbean and beyond. Imagine walking into a port town as a pirate crew arrived with fresh plunder. Dozens of men poured into taverns, their pockets heavy with coin. They bought drinks for everyone, paid musicians, gambled wildly, and dressed themselves in silks and jewels stolen from across the world. To the poor, they looked like God's men who had taken by force what kings hoarded. To merchants and governors, they looked like a plague. And they were both right. The fairness of loot division meant that wealth spread rapidly among the crew, creating sudden bursts of spending that electrified pirate havens but terrified authorities, because what was money, after all, if not power? And here it was, in the hands of the outcasts, but governments had a weapon: patience. While pirates lived for the moment, kings and empires played the long game. They cracked down on pirate havens, offered pardons to divide crews, and hunted leaders relentlessly. When captured, pirates faced trials where the very idea of loot division was used against them. Prosecutors painted it as organized crime, proof that piracy wasn't just chaos, but a dangerous rival to legitimate trade. And when pirates swung from the gallows, their bodies swaying as warnings to others, it was more than execution. It was a message. Fairness without authority, wealth without hierarchy, would not be tolerated. And yet, even in their destruction, pirates left behind whispers of their system. Sailors who had once tasted fair shares carried stories back to merchant ships. Rumors spread of crews who elected captains, of men who received compensation for lost limbs, of codes that treated the lowest sailor as an equal to the fiercest fighter. These whispers haunted governments because they revealed a simple truth: fairness was possible, even in the lawless world of piracy, and if outlaws could achieve it, why not ordinary men? That question lingered, unsettling rulers long after the pirate flags had vanished from the seas. But let's not romanticize too much. Pirate loot division was fairer than many systems of its day, yes, but it was still built on violence and theft. The gold being divided wasn't earned, it was stolen. Every coin represented someone else's labor, someone else's suffering. Merchant crews often lost everything. Coastal villages were burned, slaves were bought and sold like cattle. Pirates shared wealth among themselves, but their fairness was built on the backs of others. That contradiction is important because it shows us the dark heart of the system: equality inside, cruelty outside. Brotherhood for some, devastation for others. It is this paradox that makes piracy both fascinating and unsettling. And yet, paradoxes are often the most powerful teachers. Because in their ruthless way, pirates proved that fairness doesn't require kings, governments, or noble ideals. It requires incentives. It requires rules enforced by those with skin in the game. It requires transparency and fear of consequences. In other words, the pirate system was practical justice, brutal, bloody, but effective. And that raises an uncomfortable question for us today. If pirates could create fairness under threat of mutiny, why do modern systems so often fail to do the same? Why do we tolerate such vast inequalities when men with nothing but cutlasses and courage once demanded more? This is where the story becomes more than history. The division of loot wasn't just about pirates, it was about human nature. Give people a voice, give them a share, give them justice, and they will fight harder, risk more, and stay loyal longer. Strip them of those things, and they will rebel, desert, or despair. Pirates understood this instinctively because their lives depended on it. Governments of the time ignored it, and in doing so, they created the very conditions that made piracy thrive. Every lash on a sailor's back, every stolen wage, every injustice at sea, these were sparks that drove men into the arms of pirate crews, where at least they were promised a fair cut. And so, the system of loot division becomes more than a curiosity. It becomes a mirror reflecting both the best and worst of us. The best, fairness, equality, shared risk, and reward. The worst, greed, exploitation of outsiders, short-term recklessness. It is both a warning and an inspiration, reminding us that justice can be carved out even in lawlessness. But that, without vision, it collapses into self-destruction. Picture one final scene before we move to the end. A pirate crew, battered and weary, gathers for what they know will be their last division. The navy is closing in. Their days are numbered. But still, they sit in a circle, the quartermaster counting silver with steady hands. Each man takes his share, heavy coins pressed into calloused palms. For a moment, the fear fades. For a moment, the world makes sense. They are equals, bound not by law, not by nation, but by the clink of treasure divided justly. Tomorrow they may hang. But tonight they are rich and they are free. The story of pirate loot division ends where it began, with men staring into the abyss of danger, gambling everything for a fleeting taste of freedom. But to close this tale, let's draw the threads together and ask, what did it all mean? What do we learn from the way pirates shared their spoils? And why does this strange system still fascinate us centuries later? First, it meant survival. On a pirate ship, death was always close disease, battle, storm, or the hangman's noose. In that environment, fairness wasn't a luxury, it was oxygen. The promise of a fair share kept knives in their sheaths, kept men charging into battle, kept ships from tearing themselves apart. The system of loot division was the glue that bound crews of desperate men into something greater than themselves. Without it, piracy would have collapsed into chaos almost instantly. With it, piracy became a force that shook empires. Second, it meant equality, but only within limits. For a brief moment, a carpenter, a gunner, and a captain stood almost as equals in wealth. A man who might have been whipped and starved under a navy flag found dignity and coin under the Jolly Roger. This equality was radical for its time. It whispered of a world where hierarchy could be challenged, where even the lowest could claim power. And that whisper terrified kings and merchants more than cannons ever could. Because if equality could bloom among thieves, what might happen if it took root among ordinary people? Third, it meant contradiction. Pirate, fairness existed only within their own circle. Outside it, they were predators. They divided gold among themselves but cared little for the suffering of those they plundered. They offered compensation for a lost leg, but they sold human beings without hesitation. Their democracy was real, but it was also ruthless. They built islands of fairness in a sea of cruelty. That paradox is what makes their story so haunting, because it shows how justice can thrive in one place, while injustice festers all around it. Fourth, it meant impermanence. Loot, division, created loyalty and courage, but it also fueled recklessness. With no thought for tomorrow, pirates spent their shares in wild bursts, then returned to sea for more. The system was a fire, bright but unsustainable. It worked for small crews and short lives, but it could never have supported a lasting society. Pirates weren't builders. They were burners, living fast, dying young, and leaving behind legends. Their system was brilliant, but it was also doomed. And, finally, it meant legacy. Even after the golden age of piracy faded, the echoes of loot, division remained. The idea of shares, of equal voice, of compensation for risk. These ideas found their way into whispers of democracy, workers' rights, and even modern insurance. Pirates didn't invent these concepts, but they lived them brutally and vividly in a world that denied them to ordinary men. And so, their system lingers in our imagination, not just because it was dramatic, but because it felt ahead of its time. So what do we see, standing back from the smoke of the cannons and the glitter of the coins? We see a lesson in human nature, that even in lawlessness, people will build order, that even in greed, they will demand fairness, that even in violence, they will carve out justice, if only for themselves. Pirates remind us that systems don't come from ideals alone. They come from need, from fear, from the raw bargain between survival and ambition. And when those needs align, even thieves can become lawmakers, even killers can become brothers. Picture the last scene. A pirate, old before his years, sits alone in a tavern. His pockets are empty, his friends are dead or hanged. The golden days are gone. But in his mind, he still hears the clink of coins counted on deck, still sees the circle of men receiving their shares, still feels the strange pride of belonging to something fierce and fair, if only for a moment. He smiles, raises his mug, and mutters, "We had our share." And in those words lies the essence of the pirate's creed, not riches alone, but the proof that for once, in a world that scorned them, they were equals. And perhaps that's why we still tell their stories. Because deep down, we all crave the same thing: to be seen, to be valued, to know that our risks will be rewarded. Our sacrifice is honored. Pirates found that, if only briefly, through the division of loot. And though their sails have long vanished from the seas, the lesson remains: fairness has power. Fairness can turn desperate men into legends. Fairness, even among thieves, can shape history. So the next time you picture a chest of gold being cracked open on a creaking deck, don't imagine chaos, imagine order. Imagine rules written in blood and rum. Imagine the quartermaster's voice, steady as he counts. Imagine the crew waiting, tense but trusting, until the last coin is placed and the last man smiles with silver in his palm. That was the true heartbeat of piracy, not just plunder, not just violence, but the strange, fleeting justice of a share. And that is the story of how pirates turned loot into law, greed into order, and chaos into one of the most remarkable experiments in equality the seas have ever known. If you enjoyed sailing through this tale, join the crew, subscribe, and never miss the next story.